Hi. So this lecture we're going to talk about muscle metabolism, and then we'll briefly cover the differences between smooth and cardiac muscle, and that is basically it for this unit. So muscles need ATP, which we know is energy, and they need this for multiple different parts of the muscle contraction. So that power stroke, the part where myosin is actually physically moving. We need ATP to release the actin-myosin cross-bridge. So actin and myosin are bound together, and in order for them to let go of each other, we need a new ATP molecule to bind, so we require energy to actually relax. Calcium, sodium, and potassium all are ions that get pumped against their concentration gradient. So in order to move something against its normal gradient, we require energy. The body creates ATP through three main mechanisms, and we'll discuss each of these on the next few slides. The first type is called a phosphagen system, and this works immediately, but it only lasts a few seconds. So there are two different systems within the phosphagen system, but basically both of them are transferring phosphate groups to make ATP. And I will go through each of these types below. So the first part of the phosphagen system is the myokinase system, and the protein myokinase basically just transfers a phosphate group. So we start with two molecules of adenosine diphosphate, which means it has two phosphate groups. And we take one of the molecules of phosphate and add it to the other ADP, and then we end up with ATP, which is adenosine triphosphate. So three molecules of phosphate, and then we also end up with adenosine monophosphate, just one phosphate group. So this is adenosine triphosphate with three phosphate groups. And then over here, this is adenosine monophosphate with only one phosphate group. So basically, myokinase just shifted where the phosphate is. So the result is ATP that has a bunch of energy, and then AMP, which is very low in energy. Something very similar happens with creatine kinase. So we start with ADP, adenosine diphosphate, and creatine phosphate. The phosphate from the creatine phosphate is added to adenosine diphosphate to make one molecule of adenosine triphosphate, and the remainder is creatine. The other system that we can use is glycolysis. So glycolysis is anaerobic, which means it does not use oxygen. And this system kind of starts to take over as soon as the phosphagen system is kind of wearing out. So what glycolysis is taking molecules of glucose or glycogen and taking them through a bunch of different steps that you guys don't need to know. And it turns glycolysis, it breaks it apart and forms something called pyruvic acid. And through this process, you can see there are arrows pointing out that show a release of adenosine triphosphate. So by breaking glucose down, we're releasing energy. And the problem with this is pyruvic acid gets quickly converted to lactic acid in the body. And you guys have probably heard of lactic acid as something that happens in your muscles during intense exercise. The problem with lactic acid is it is acidic, and that causes the pH of the cells to decrease. And like I talked about before, they're very high maintenance cells and they do not like to work in a very acidic environment. So the muscle contraction kind of slows and eventually stops if there's too much lactic acid. The third mechanism for creating ATP is called aerobic respiration. This goes through a bunch of different steps in the mitochondria. It is aerobic, so it uses oxygen, and it is very slow to start. It takes 3 to 4 minutes before it is in full production, but this system can last for hours or even days if it needs to. So you can run an aerobic respiration very long term. Aerobic respiration creates 36 to 38 ATP per 1 glucose molecule. So this is very, very efficient. If we go back and look at glycolysis, 1 molecule of glucose only gives us 3 ATP. So I don't know about you, but I would much prefer to use 1 glucose molecule and get 36 ATP versus in glycolysis only getting 3 ATP. So aerobic respiration is much more efficient. The problem with aerobic respiration is eventually we run out of glycogen and glucose and there's no more things to use for energy. The other problem, eventually, if you're doing like an ultra marathon or something, you lose fluid and electrolytes through your sweat. So to take care of these problems, marathon runners will be drinking Gatorade. They have like weird chewy things that are full of sugar. And the goal is to keep glucose up, keep fluid and electrolytes up so that they can continue for hours or days on this system. So here's a chart that basically summarizes what you need to know about each of these systems. So each system has the speed in which it activates. So on the left column here, the phosphagen system is really, really quick. In the middle, the glycolysis system is medium. And then aerobic respiration is pretty slow. The mechanism for how it works. So I won't ask you to know all the specific steps. You should just generally know. So for the phosphagen system, myokinase steals a phosphate to make 1 ATP and 1 AMP. Creatine kinase steals a phosphate to make 1 ATP and creatine. This is anaerobic, but it only lasts a few seconds. Glycolysis, you take 1 molecule of glucose and it gets turned into pyruvic acid and 3 ATP. There's no oxygen required, it's anaerobic, but the problem is lactic acid builds up and muscle contraction stops when it's too acidic. Aerobic respiration goes through the citric acid cycle and the electron transport chain. Don't need to know the steps of those. And then aerobic respiration uses oxygen. The problem with this is that it takes a few minutes to start getting optimal production of ATP, but once it does, it can last as long as you have glucose, glycogen, fluids, and electrolytes. This graph here is comparing the 3 different systems. So this blue line here is the phosphagen system, and the graph we're looking at, the y-axis has percent of total energy, and the x-axis is looking at time in seconds. So right away when you're trying to run, the phosphagen system is the only system working, but it very quickly tapers off. The red line here is showing the glycolysis system. So it's starting to ramp up and then it reaches its peak somewhere around a minute and then it slowly fades. the oxidative phosphorylation or aerobic respiration. This system in green is kind of slowly building up, and it might take a few minutes, but once it builds up, this can last for a very, very long time. This chart is kind of showing the same thing as the previous one. This is a track with 3 different people running on it. So, for example, this blonde person here is running 50 meters, so that's a very short sprint. And during this short sprint, the system she is using is going to be the phosphagen system. Next person here with black hair is running 400 meters, which is about a minute. And this person is running on glycolysis at this point. This kind of redhead person over here has been running for a long time, several minutes. He's running basically only on aerobic respiration, and he can keep running as long as he wants, as long as he has glucose, glycogen, fluid, and electrolytes. So why do we get tired? If aerobic respiration can produce ATP for so long, why do we get tired? So tired we call fatigue, and this is progressive weakness and the loss of contractility. So what happens, the sarcoplasmic reticulum that has those little calcium pumps that are pumping calcium don't work as well as they continue on, and the channels get leaky, so calcium kind of equalizes and you can't have quite the same muscle contraction. As glycogen and glucose are being consumed, the amount of ATP synthesis decreases. So at 3 hours into a marathon, someone's not going to have a whole lot of glucose left, so they get tired. The other problem is lactic acid being produced, which I already said decreases the pH, and the high maintenance muscle cells do not like to work in that environment. And then if we think about the signal coming from the nerve, the nerves are releasing acetylcholine, and eventually after lots and lots of signals to the muscles, there's not very much acetylcholine left, so eventually we're not even able to signal a muscle that we want to contract, even if the muscle could. So endurance is the ability to maintain high intensity exercise. Is basically how in shape you are. This depends on a lot of different things and can be measured with many different formulas, but as you guys can see, this is red text, so don't worry about it for your exam.